Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Well, this is the Coaches Club, a venture started by the Global Athletics Coaching Academy, and has been picked up, of course, by World Athletics. And we have this event once a quarter. If you imagine the quarter starting from June, and we pick up a theme that we believe coaches really need to hear about. And there's a particularly important theme today. It's a very, very practical one. But I've done my bits of introduction. My name is Frank Dick, by the way, the chair of the Global Athletics Coaching Academy. This event has been pulled together by Jimson Lee and promoted in the background by Sheila Aiken and by Senna Beckridge. But without any further ado, let's go to the Supremo, Cliff Mellett.
Thank you very much, Frank, and a warm welcome to Coaching Matters Eastern Forum. Tonight we're going to chat about developing an athlete's technical model. And like much in coaching, there are varying views about how you might go about that process. But how do you create an adaptive learning environment to support technical development? And indeed, what are you trying to achieve, how, and why? So we open this discussion with a short presentation from three highly experienced and successful coaches and coach developers about their blueprints related to this important topic and how it has evolved over their coaching journey. And these will include their insights in around, well, what's negotiable and what is not. And after the three presentations, we will engage in a general conversation with this group, this panel, for about half an hour. And then we're going to open up to the audience for 20 minutes or so for a Q&A via the chat room. And then Frank will summate in the last 5 to 10 minutes. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Martin Bingaser. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but I apologize, Martin. But he's 11-time Swiss hammer throw champion, and he's the current Swiss national hammer throw coach. And he's been there since 2013. And my understanding is on his LinkedIn account that in his spare time he's a commercial lawyer. So I'm going to hand over to Martin to share his insights.
Thank you. You pronounced it right. I'm not a doctor, but otherwise it's good.
Okay.
Let me pull up my slides here. Oh, sorry. Here we go.
There.
Everyone can see the slides okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Good. Yeah, as I mentioned, the topic today is developing a technical model. And in the throwing events in particular, I think we've seen big leaps forward in understanding not just technique over the last decade, but also understanding how to find the right technical model for your athlete. And then the shot put, for example, we see that tremendously. 20, 30 years ago, the question was, should my athlete use rotational technique or the glide technique? And, those were two different technical models, but they were viewed as just, one option or the other. And now I think the big step forward we've seen in the shot put in the last few years, and we've seen the results jump off immensely, is because people understand the rotational technique is not just one technical model. It's an umbrella. And under that, you can have so many different ways to throw the shot put within that. And we're seeing these breakthroughs as athletes start to find how they can make these tweaks, how they can change the technical model to fit their strengths and get the most out of it. And we're seeing crazy results. Some of the best all-time performances, most consistent all-time performances, because people are starting to adapt the models to their athletes and create their own technical models. As we see these and we watch these top throwers now, it's important to ask questions, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. What questions are the right ones to ask? And for me, the most important questions are threefold. How is my athlete different? Understand your athlete, understand what they bring to the table. How is the technical model different? What does the technical model really leverage? How is it generating the speed? How is it generating the power? And then how can I align those two? How can I find the strengths of the technical model, the strengths of the athlete, and bring those together? But, to start with, I think it's helpful to look at some examples from elite athletes and stepping outside my comfort zone a little bit here. Actually, I just want to back up quickly here first. when we watch some of these athletes and we see them doing different things, for example, Ryan Krauser, over the last year or two, he's developed the Krauser slide, it's called, where he takes a small step with his left foot as he's starting the throw. And Matt Denny in the discus from Australia too, he also has started to use a little bit of a step in with his right foot. We're getting these athletes starting to do these tweaks in deviating from the traditional models of the throw. And there are typically two reactions that coaches come forward with. One is, wow, that looks cool, let me try that. And the second reaction is, wow, if they only threw normal, they would throw even further. Krauser would have 24 meters if he threw further. These other athletes would do even better. And so that's why I think it's important, before we just jump to conclusions and we either critique the athlete or we copy the athlete, we ask these three questions. We ask, why is that athlete doing it? Why is that technical model working for them? And does that line up? And would that line up for our own athletes? So, that's a good starting point here, because our instinct is always to copy or critique and never just to ask questions first. So ask those questions. To give an example of that, Mondo Duplantis in the pole vault, one thing you notice it's very different about his technique compared to elite pole vaulters. And again, I'm stepping outside my comfort zone here. Talked with Herbert Svingholm, is also a friend of the Global Athletics coaching. But one thing that he does different is his pole drop is very early. And you see in this picture, his pole is coming into contact with the ground 30, 50 centimeters before the box. Typically in the pole vault, the pole is coming and making contact in the box. Instead, he's coming before the box and then slides it into the box. And, a lot of people watching the pole vault will say, oh, well, he could have, if he only did it traditionally, he would be even better. He's the best of all time. He's jumping these historic heights. He could only do it. If he did it better, or more traditionally, he would jump higher. By bringing it down early, he's slowing himself down before the box, so he's losing some of the momentum. But it's interesting, rather than just, again, critiquing from the start, why is he doing this? And his father and coach at Pole Vault Summit in Italy last year had a presentation where he talked about this a bit. And, it's not scientifically validated, but their working hypothesis is, he has these massively long poles, and his speed is something like 10% faster than a lot of his competitors, or even historically anyone over 6 meters. So he's bringing a ton of speed, and longest poles out there. And what that does is, at the top of the pole, it creates a bit of vibration. And the analogy he used is, if you watch a javelin throw, if you watch a bow and arrow, when you're shooting the arrow, it's going straight, but it has like a lot of vibrations in it. And the same thing, the pole has a lot of vibration. So by bringing it down to the ground earlier, he dampens that vibration so that when it hits the box, there's a cleaner transfer of energy when it goes in there. So, it's kind of trying to create a problem only he has. He's bringing all these forces and speed and everything in there. He's probably getting more vibration than others. So that's a strategy he's used to help. Maybe it slows him down a little bit, but he's going to have more energy transfer when it comes into the pole, when he leaves the ground. Whether that's actually the case, like I said, it hasn't been validated. This is their reasoning for it. He's also been doing this since he was a child, so before he had the same amount of forces. So maybe he's just trying to justify an existing reason for it. But it's helpful to understand, okay, there is a reason behind it, and if that's an issue for your athlete, maybe it's something to look at. But if your athlete's jumping fine with a more traditional technique and doesn't run into those issues, you don't necessarily need to adapt that technical model, but understanding that, why is he doing it? What are his strengths? His tremendous speed he brings into the pole. Those are important to understand, why he's finding those solutions in his technique that he has. And I mentioned the shot put earlier. Like, big difference in the shot put over the last couple of years has been the development of different versions of the rotational technique. And, specifically even at the start of the throw, you watch the start of the throw and you get very different starts. So Reese Hoffa, he's actually turning on his left foot. He turns on the heel or side of his foot, which is quite unique. Joachim Olsen was an Olympic medalist for Denmark. He starts very statically. He doesn't even wind up when he throws. Tom Walsh, on the other hand, his right foot is back more, giving him even a longer path of acceleration into the entry of the throw. Andy Bloom, one of the top Americans back in 2000, it started extremely low in the throw. Adam Nelson was little bit higher, but very rotational based. He would get so much stretch out of the front and also in the middle of the throw. And if you watch all of these throwers, they look quite different in style, in rhythm, and they've all, I think except Andy Bloom, all have had 22 meters. So different ways to get to the same result. And each of them, they have their own strengths, they have their own backgrounds, and it plays to what their strengths are. What's interesting too in the hammer, you could also do the same type of thing here. 3 examples with Koji Murfushi, Betty Heidler, and Yuri Sedik. They're starting very differently in their technique, but they reach similar end positions. And I'm assuming, in the high jump and the pole vault too, they're different approach varieties, but they're starting to hit some certain key points and some certain positions throughout their throw. So there's a lot of differences if you look back here, but there's still similarities. It's not that these are vastly 100% different techniques. So I think in your event, it's helpful to go through. And what I do is I look at, okay, what are the non-negotiables? What are the negotiables? And then what are these also partially negotiable things? And my main event that I'm coaching is the hammer throw. And, the more and more the years I've been coaching, I make this list, and the list of non-negotiables gets smaller and smaller. Because not just because of my own athletes and my own experience, but I just look at elite throwers, and I see people getting elite results in very different ways. And I start to think, okay, well, maybe that's not necessary. Maybe you can get to that level without doing a certain thing. And, to start with the non-negotiables, the speed of release, the ball has to be traveling a certain speed if you want to fly over 80 meters. There's no way around that. If the ball is not traveling fast enough, it will not fly far enough. And, more or less you need a balance and a sense of rhythm. And here I'm not talking about a specific rhythm. But what I see is, you could talk about it in terms of music. Jazz has a rhythm, punk rock has a rhythm, classical music has a rhythm. They're very different rhythms, but all the best music has a rhythm. And same thing with hammer throw. You have some throwers that might throw more like punk rock style. You have some that are more classical music style, but they all have a rhythm to them. And it's with, 4 turns or 3 turns in the hammer throw. That rhythm is key to being able to continually accelerate the hammer. Now, what is negotiable if we go to the other side? Sorry about that. What type of rhythm? Like, as I said, there are different types, so that it's a wide range. You look at the head position. Traditionally, everyone used to say, okay, the head should be aligned with the hammer. But you also have Litvinov was leading with the head. How the winds are, how many winds you're taking, what style of winds. Do you step in with your foot? Are they flat? Are they steep? You look at the top throwers and they're all over the place in those things. And then in the middle too, you also have some where, there's some negotiable within some parameters. So yeah, you have elite throwers with 3 and 4 turns now. The top, the world record's still with 3 turns, and the number 2 in the world this season is also with 3 turns. So 3 turns can still work. 4 turns is definitely a dominant style. No one's doing 2 turns. You have a couple guys doing 5 turns, but there is some play and some choice there. Where the low point is, what is the angle of release? Again, the angle of release, it's not going to go straight up because you're going to hit the ground. It's not going to go really flat, but there's some wiggle room between 37 and 42, 3%. Some athletes might fit a bit better with steeper, some with flatter, but you have some play and you can really find within some parameters what's best for your athlete. And also, like double support, the traditional hammer throw model is the longer you have 2 feet on the ground, the better. You can accelerate the hammer better. With both feet on the ground, obviously, and your balance is going to be better in all these points. And, the more and more research they do, actually, there's not a huge correlation between the amount of time on the ground and the result of the distance thrown. Obviously, again, you're not going to have someone who's only on the ground 10% of the time. You're typically talking between 45 and 55%. But what's important here is not just how much time you're on the ground, but how you use that time on the ground. So you can get away with less time on the ground if you're being better at using that time. So you see, again, some of the top athletes might have a little bit less double support time, but they're using it efficiently, and it works. And so, like I mentioned in the questions at the start, how is your athlete different? How is the technique different? a lot of what we're talking about is the difference, and understand that difference. It's focusing on that difference and getting the most out of understanding that difference. And Steve Merlin is a strength conditioning coach in the US, one of my mentors, via Vern Gambetta, who's on the Vern will be on the West Forum, but he says it's always about the difference. Understand the difference as a coach, and that's going to unlock the keys to success. So what are the differences we're looking for? What do I look for? How is the body made up? An athlete like a Ryan Krauser, he's 6'7", so over 2 meters. He's going to have a very different technique than a Reese Hoffa, who's 1.80 meters, maybe. They've got different levers. They've got different height. They've got different body weight. They've got different arm span. Ryan Krauser can use leverage a lot more. The ring is comparatively small for him. Being a real big guy, he can eat up ring space very quickly. So he's going to have to use a different technical solution just based on how his body is made up. So understanding how the body is built is important. Also, Krauser's going to have a higher center of gravity. All these things in the hammer throw, that's very important because you're trying to counter the pull of the implement. Where your center of mass is going to be quite important. Where their athletic abilities and background are, what's their coordination, what's their ability to learn, to feel the implement, how good is their mobility. Jordan Geist, one of the top dual event throwers in the world right now, is 76 meters in the hammer. And his main event is 22 meters in the shot put. Unfortunately, he's from America, so he was fourth in both events and didn't make the Olympics last year. But he's throwing hammer, and you can tell he's a shot putter. His big chest, big arms. He's not going to be as mobile as someone like Koji Murafushi was, and that's going to mean he's going to have different positions in the hammer. And is that good? Is that bad? Well, I don't know, but you just have to. That's something you have to deal with as a coach. You have to understand what's their mobility. Are they even going to be able to get the same positions? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Frank talks about this a lot, but really, my philosophy is build on the athlete's strengths. Really try and leverage them, understand what they do well, and build a technical model around that. And we talk about like physical strengths, but I also think, understanding what type of athlete you have and how do they accelerate? What are their strategies? Some athletes are more elastic athletes. Some athletes are more strength athletes. Even watching them and jumping and lifting, you can start to see athletes, we have athletes that are more push or pull athletes. The push athletes are excelling at squat and things like that. And the pulling athletes are really good at the Olympic lifts. But that can translate into the technique. Are you generating the power out of the legs? Are you generating out of the upper body? And, a Stefan Holm versus Donald Thomas is always the comparison in the high jump. One very elastic, one very speed-based. But in all the events, you have different types of athletes. And also in the javelin, you have the slow approach where they just plant and power it out there. And you have the fast approach where they are almost throwing themselves with the implement in a very elastic throw. And again, in the technical model, what's different about it? Is it relying on active or passive acceleration? Are you concentrically generating force, or are you using stretch reflex? Are you using your leverage? Like Ryan Krauser with his really long length. Are you using inertia? Are you working with the implement or for the implement in the technical model? Where does that power come from? Is it, different athletes, even in the shot put, of course you're using your whole body, but you have some techniques that are very much more coming out of the upper body with the strength, some coming more out of the lower body, and that can translate into higher or lower body positions. So, these are all things you look at with the technical model to see where are they really generating their technique, where are they generating the strength from? And then, as I said, align those. If you're an athlete that's really lower body dominant and very leg strength dominant, and you have a technical model that's very leg strength dominant, those are going to align well. But if you have the same athlete, and you're having them use a technical model that's really trying to use an elastic upper body reaction to throw the implement, probably not going to fit very well. So it's trying to align those two. Just to close this out and turn over to others. Ryan Krauser here's on the left and Brian Oldfield's on the right. Again, Krauser, what are his strengths? He's a massive stand throw, like one of the best in history. He's also, as I said, over 2 meters tall, really long levers. So basically, he doesn't need to start really fast because he can generate a lot of power from the stand throw position. He just needs to get into that position, controlled enough where he can add a little bit more to it and work the ground a really long time, like in his stand throw. And you notice in his technique and his technical model too, he's very controlled and slow out of the back. he gets a good power position with a little bit more stretch than he would with a stand throw. He works the ground a long time. At the point of release here, he's barely leaves the ground, maybe 1 centimeter above the ground, but he has long contact with the ground, working the ground until the very end and throwing it. And world record distance. Brian Oldfield in the 70s, one of his strengths is, he could dunk a shot put. He's an extreme jumper, extreme explosive, quick, fast athlete. And his technical model was basically like a jump out of the power position. You see here, he's 30 centimeters up in the air at the point of release. And he's again just trying. He's also a little bit shorter than Ryan. He wasn't short, but he's shorter, so he doesn't have the same height of release, which in the shot put plays a bigger role than the hammer and discus. But by jumping up, he gets a higher height of release. He leverages some of his strengths, which is his elastic jumping ability, and it's a technical model that works for him. But both of these were world-class athletes. Both of them work well. I don't want to come here and say any technique works, because there's definitely some things to do right and some things to do wrong. But they're both examples of finding their own strengths and building technique around what works for their strengths. So that's my kickoff point. So back to you, Cliff.
Very good.
You're on mute, Cliff.
Sorry. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, some really good insights there, and I think that'll sort of stimulate some conversation after Adam and Chris present their thoughts. So we'll go over to Adam. Adam is a former professional tennis player, and now I can say with confidence he's a passionate director for coaching at Tennis Australia. He's got a PhD in coaching, and that PhD, he went around many of the world's most successful tennis academies to find out more about how they create their daily training environment. So over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Cliff. So yeah, I'm really lucky to get an opportunity to speak to a cohort of coaches and people that are definitely, I can honestly say, it's outside my field, and so really interested in any questions or discussion you have as I present, Tennis Australia, and it really is our coaching model that we have and how we think about developing technique in junior tennis players, but also our professional athletes that are on tour. So at Tennis Australia, when we think about developing a technical model, the one thing I will say is that the sport is built around consistency of performance. So the technical models that we build around an athlete, it really is to serve the performance of the athlete and their ability to consistently back up performance week after week. You would have seen possibly in the news a few of our athletes complaining about the schedule. We have a number of professional athletes that have been traveling and playing non-stop for probably 23 to 24 weeks at present. They have coaches with them on the road, but it's an incredibly big proposition to play that many matches in a year and continually repeat that performance. So when you think about a sport like tennis, leveraging the competitive experience and using that really to drive technical development of your athletes is really paramount. So we look to always anchor the technical model to the competition relevant tasks that or outcomes that we're trying to get for an athlete. And so we spend a lot of time looking at how we build an environment and how we build the technique so that it's tested in game situations, it's tested under pressure, and in the specific contexts that they're getting from their matches. So we really also spend a lot of time in the training environment, looking at when we shape the representative tasks, how effective are they and how relevant are they going to be when they go into competition. So I can't stress that part enough. Really, a lot of our work around technique is designing an environment that will test any kind of technical models. And if you look at tennis through the ages, I think you will see that there are a lot of different players who win a lot of different ways with a lot of different techniques. And Martin made a really adept comment. I think that there are a lot of different ways to have success, but there are also some absolute non-negotiables that you've got to employ. So what I would say is that in tennis, different from some of your more, or maybe the athletic supports, the competition is a massive driver. Secondly to that one, I was fortunate enough to do some work around, from a research perspective, Cliff mentioned it, and I was fortunate enough to travel around the world, talk to a lot of different tennis coaches. And so one of the things was in developing a technical model, it's really about a co-created clear vision of coaching. And one story that I'll share is we had an athlete who was really passionate about switching from a one-handed backhand to a two-handed backhand. And the athlete was absolutely adamant that their two-handed backhand would be better than their one-handed backhand. And so they worked on it, and we did practice sessions. We videotaped it. We've got all this on file. They really wanted to make that change. Professional athlete, top of their game. The double-handed backhand technique was perfect, absolutely flawless in practice. It was unbelievable how much better they were using two-handed backhand. But once they went into play and they went into competition, they just could not win a match. And simply because we'd isolated the task, and they had a perfect double-handed backhand, but it affected the tactics that they were using. They no longer serve volleyed as much. They no longer ran around their backhand to try to use their forehand, which was actually their weapon. And so actually the knowledge from examples like that has taught us in tennis that the aesthetics of technique are not as important as the performance under pressure and in competition that you have with your athlete. So I'll mention that, and Cliff guided me a little bit on this one when I was still coaching. Cliff's always been passionate about co-constructing technique with an athlete and letting them have a say, and that coaches are a really important part of the athlete development process. But in tennis, it really is one of those relationships where you're on the road every single day with a player. You're watching their matches. They really do have a big stake in their own development and the way they want to develop the game. So, ultimately, it's not about perfect form. I think if there's one takeaway, it's kind of technique should be fit for purpose. It has to be owned by the athlete if you're going to get buy-in and engagement. And it's really important that you refine an environment that really creates those situations where the athlete's performing under pressure. And then you're going to be really effective. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, over to you, Chris. Chris is a former decathlete and head coach for the Paralympics for Sydney for athletics in 2000. He's had a 17-year stint as a performance consultant with Oceania Paralympic Committee, and he works extensively in our region. And he brings a lot of depth and breadth to coaching knowledge, particularly in the para space, that we think is really relevant to coaching of all athletes. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Cliff, and I really appreciate the comments from Martin and Adam. Very insightful. Look, I'm going to take a slightly different approach in terms of developing the technical model, and probably more aligned with Adam than Martin's technical elements. But I've got a few points, and I'd welcome some opportunities to get some feedback from people. But particularly want to start with any coach is understanding your technical model. And as Martin was saying, he's done an extensive amount of work comparing different athletes in different events. And the variation at the elite end is the end product of coaches and athletes working together to say what works and what doesn't work. But for a beginning coach or an emerging coach, I find it is absolutely critical that you do have a technical model in mind. Where do you want to take the athlete? So we all know if you get a kid that's been swimming most of its life and turns up at 16 without doing much training in track and field, but wants to be a sprinter, we sort of all know what that should look like and where the hips should be, what the ground forces would look like. So it is the starting point without any question, is to have a technical model in mind. What do the elite do? And how do you relate to that in terms of the journey that you're about to go on? I do like the words that are being used about co-constructing. I tend to use the word when I'm working with coaches, sharing the journey. And the sharing of the journey is absolutely getting feedback from your athletes, particularly around when they're performing. I'm very hesitant to give any feedback that's negative. I think it's like tearing a scar open and, you know, the words of no, 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 no. Well, you're just reinforcing what's not good. But when they get it right, to be able to ask the athlete, how did that feel? Really resonating with what did they feel when they actually performed something well? And then the second question I always ask is, what was your focus? So then I can remind them what their focus was when they actually performed something well. So my first message to all coaches is know your event. You cannot be an elite coach or even a coach of emerging, developing athletes unless you know your event. It's also the same message I give to any athlete I've coached. Know your event. You have to be a student of your event. And that includes all the rules, because the rules will make a difference when ultimately you're in competition. My second comment would be around, I think back to when I was a young coach and I was enthusiastic and energetic and I knew it all. There's no question of that. I was the ants pants when it came to coaching, and I used to tell everybody about it, particularly the athletes. And what I've realized as I've got older and wiser and spent a bit of time with people like Cliff and other track and field coaches, the less you say is the better. We tend to confuse our athletes with so much knowledge, and it's often with emerging coaches a result of enthusiasm as much as anything. But I like to now observe an athlete repeat an activity several times and look for a pattern. And once I understand the pattern of the athlete, then it's a very simple thing to make small adjustments. We don't try and change the whole thing. And I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen a coach say, get your feet in the right position, and then talk about where the hand went in the last throw. It just changes everything and confuses the athlete. So I really like to keep things very, very simple, but it's recognizing what the athlete's pattern is at the time, understanding your elite model, and how do we adjust the athlete to fit the ideal model, and making very simple adjustments. I would also, and particularly around any sport, I think this is the case, but particularly in track and field, we deal in a sport that is a summation of force. And I think that's pretty much the case with any activity or sport. And so my approach is always look at what the feet are doing and then build on that. Now, obviously, if you're coaching, let's use the example that goes back to what Martin was talking about, shot put. There are some technical rules, and it's probably the one event where athletes get fouled more often than anything when they're young. You can run 100 meters, it doesn't matter what you look like, you'll still get from A to B as long as you stay within the lines. But there are some rules around how you deliver a shot put that need to be taught early. So it's probably the variation there in terms of getting a technical model and giving the athletes confidence that when they go into competition, they can be successful. And as coaches, we understand the need for creating an environment where athletes will feel success. Create small success elements they are committed to improving. So the summation of force for me is something I try and work with the coaches that I'm dealing with. Work out what the feet are doing and how that's affecting what the hips and legs are doing, and how that's affecting what the upper body is doing in terms of the arms and positions and the head. So I always try and approach it from the ground up, and then you fine tune what is happening around those adjustments. And I guess what I'm ultimately looking for, and both Adam and Martin have spoken about, it's call it what you want, but it's a performance posture. We have to make sure that our athletes are in a position to perform. You can't teach a sprinter to sprint if he's got low hips to the ground. The feet, the legs don't have room to move under them. We can't have a hammer thrower throwing a long way if the arms are really tight and you're shortening the distance, and that's reducing the amount of speed on your implement. So there are things that we look from a performance posture, and then we start to look at the athletes. And I'll probably flip across here now to what Cliff was mentioning about my work with Paralympic sports. So when I started my journey, I worked with some very elite able-bodied athletes, Olympians, Commonwealth Games athletes, national level athletes. And as I said, I thought I had a pretty good understanding of the technical models that I was working with, and obviously being a decathlete to work across the sprints, the jumps, the throws, etc., and the middle distance events. And then I started working with people with impairment, people with one leg, people with cerebral palsy, people with a vision impairment. And each one of those conditions meant they had a variation. They brought a different set of skills to the table. They brought a different set of makeup to the table. And I had to work through and be creative in terms of, how do I make this athlete who's got cerebral palsy and half of his body's affected fit what I understand as a technical model? And I spent an enormous amount of time thinking, well, I can't get them. Pretty much all the athletes I worked with were inefficient movers. So a lot of the conditioning work that I did with them wasn't on the land. I was hurting them. with the amount of work that they needed to do to be successful, I was actually creating opportunities for injury. So pretty much by the end of my athletics career, my athletic coaching career was doing physical conditioning in the water. And for me, it wasn't about rehab. It was absolutely about prehabilitation. The stronger the athletes were in the water, the less likely they were to sustain an injury, and the better the quality of performance I got when we were out training, whether that was my sprinters or the throwers. We had a much higher quality of training because it wasn't so much focused around the conditioning elements. We did that elsewhere. So that was the other thing, and it was about a state of readiness. So this is what I term as the state of readiness for any athlete at any age, including your elite athletes. And as Martin was saying, the athletes that he's talking about making fine-tuning that elite performance, in some cases have spent 15 or 20 years to get to that level. So let's not rush athletes into making fine-tuning errors and looking for those 1%ers. It's an element of coaching that says, I've got to get those 99% bits right. And then I know I've got a good quality athlete before I start chasing that 1%, and before I can understand how that 1% is going to benefit the athlete that I'm working with. So, and critically important to this is the transfer of junior athletes into senior athletes. And we're involved in athletics as a sport where you go from an implement size where they can throw up very well. Everything changes when you pick up a 7.26 kilogram shot put or a hammer, and then pick up the 2 kilogram discus. The weights change everything. So transitioning from a junior to a senior sometimes takes time. Well, it always takes time. And making sure your athlete is strong enough, athletic enough, and we're not going to compromise performance by adding an additional weight in the hand is what I call the state of readiness. And all of the coaches would know to do that. But it is something you need to remind yourself, particularly with emerging athletes as they go from one implement to another, that you've really got to make sure that their technique isn't going to fall apart because their state of readiness isn't ready, or their strength isn't ready, or their psychology isn't ready. So they're the elements that I would just throw on the table that we can open up for discussion. But importantly, I think the one thing that hasn't been mentioned, and Cliff would be able to talk more about this than anybody else on the panel, is the state of learning and the communication with your athlete. And pretty much there's 3 types of athletes that I dealt with. There's the visual learner, the athlete who needs to watch and see what's doing. And particularly I find more and more of them these days because they can get out their phones and they can watch elite athletes from across the world. The visual learning element to the way we coach is critical these days. And then importantly, it's the auditory learning. Part of the process of the visual learning is using the right cues as a coach to make sure the athlete understands what the words mean. And I can be, many of us have stood across the stadium and had an athlete in a discus circle, and a simple word like knee or hip or shoulder. The athlete, because of the relationship you have with your coach, knows exactly what you're referring to because you've done it thousands of times in training. It doesn't need a full explanation. I sometimes get amazed by the amount of time athletes rush to the fence and talk to their coach. Well, that's not my style of coaching. It might work for other coaches, and good luck to them, but simplicity is the key for success for me. The more simple you can make a task for the athlete, the more they can focus on a particular element of their performance, my experience is a better outcome. So visually turning into auditory, and then understanding who are the kinesthetic learners, who needs to learn by feeling, and which events are best suited to that. So I can easily walk up to a shot putter and lift their shoulder and put them in the right position with a matter of seconds. I can't do that with a pole vaulter. So I need to find ways of teaching them how to be upside down and put their body in the right position and getting over a bar and what they do at the top of a pole. That's not going to be a kinesthetic awareness learner, but you might be able to do some of those elements in the gym, on bars or on the ground. So you really need to know your athlete. So what I've done there, Cliff, is just give a bit of an overview of my philosophy to teaching the model. I think we can quickly break it down into technical elements, but the successful coaches, they put it all together. And they put this all together after years of experience. And what I find is the athletes and the coaches have a relationship that is based on many years of experience together. And I sometimes get amazed by, and with the due respect, Adam, sometimes I'm surprised at how quickly a lot of tennis players change a coach if they're not getting success. And sometimes that's for good, valid reasons. But in athletics, we tend to say, right, for the next few months, we're going to make a change. And it does take time to make changes, particularly with your elite performance athletes that have spent 20 years or 15 years or 12 years. They have habits that need fine tuning, and that does take time. So my message to all coaches is be patient, get to know your athlete, put in place a good solid plan that they are committed to. And I think, Adam, you made the comment very nicely about the athlete needs to commit to the plan. Without athlete commitment, they won't get buy-in, and you won't get the results that you're looking for. So, Cliff, I'm just aware of time. I want to leave some space for questions, but pretty much that summarises my philosophy to what I'm about as a coach and what I try and do when I'm developing other coaches.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Martin and Adam as well. There's some really good insights there. I've got a question to get up our conversation started. Technical development. Okay, what does it look like for when you've got children, adolescents, and then adults? And where I'm going to is, how do you train the development of an appropriate technical model? Because what's required to win, perhaps when you're really young, is very different to the technical model once you start to mature. And once you mature, to fix or not to fix for me is a really important question. Because sometimes when you fix one thing, it leads to adverse consequences, unintended consequences. So I'm interested in that journey because we've got a mixture of coaches online who are coaching young kids, adolescents, and also mature athletes. So what are your thoughts about the development of the technical model over time? Martin?
I can start out there. As Chris was saying, I mean, you have to know the basic rules when you start off. And a lot of my presentations talking about, okay, when do you break those rules? And Dale Stevenson, Australian coach, he was up in Germany last week and we were talking, and he's working with Matt Denny, and he said, I don't know how to coach a 75-meter discus thrower. Like that's we're trying to go in uncharted territory. And by definition, then we have to break some rules to get there at that level. But you don't have to break rules to get 40 meters in the discus or 50 meters in the discus and 60 meters in discus. So understanding those basic rules and the basic starting point are key. For me, though, I think at the start, one thing to keep in mind is the simplicity. Like Occam's razor, all things being equal, the simple solution is a better solution. Try and focus on a few basics. If you're starting to throw in a real crazy manner, the more things going on, the more likely something's going to go wrong. I try to boil it down to really what are the basic 2 or 3 things we have to do, and instill that at a young age. And if there's some deviations that I can live with, I live with them. So for me, I don't necessarily try to perfect it or clean it up too much. If they're naturally going in one direction and I don't see that hindering their long-term development, I'll go with it, because maybe that's also a sign of what their feeling is like. And as Chris was saying, ask them how do they feel? Like what is it? Does that feel easy, that throw? Does that feel hard? Does that feel natural? Are they holding it here? Are they holding it here? Okay, yeah, you can put it in their hand, but you also have to see, okay, where do they feel comfortable generating power from, and lean into those things a little bit. So keep a simple model, only have a few rules, and then start. I think even from a young age, you can start to get their feedback and figure out, okay, what works well for them. And as everyone, Chris and Adam were both saying, feedback is critical. This is not just a coaching process. It's not a biomechanical process. This is a partnership. This is, with one of my elite hammer throwers this year too, we tried to make a change on the start of the throw, and I felt from my side, it was looking good. I liked how it looked, but the athlete kept telling me, it doesn't feel right. I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel the ability to generate power. And it goes back to Adam's point in tennis. Like, I don't think if we put him in train, it was looking nice. But if we put him under the pressure of competition and he's not feeling comfortable, he's not going to be able to generate a lot of force in that position. So we experimented with it, but that feeling has to guide a lot of where we're going. But yeah, I would say with the beginners, you need to have a technical model. You need to stick to it. It doesn't need to be robust. It doesn't need to be super detailed, but you need to have a few key points that you want to focus on, and but also leave some room for following the athlete. And that space, I think, for maneuverability is larger than a lot of coaches think.
Okay. Thanks, Martin. Chris or Adam, any thoughts?
I think Frank's got his hand up, but did you want to go first, Frank, or do you want me to go?
No, you go first.
Just one thing that we talk about in tennis, and I think Martin kind of nailed it, but I'll use a word, is parameters. And I think developing parameters within your model allows you to, I think, expand your lens as a coach. We talk about the coach's eye. I work a lot with coaches, my role now is I'm not with the players as much. I work with a lot of the coaches who spend a lot of time on the road, and then I also work with little kids that are just doing red ball and hot shots and our future performers. And so we talk in terms of parameters. Is the technique falling within the parameters that we think, you know, and the three questions I ask just constantly of coaches when we talk about technique, is the technique effective? Is it adaptable and repeatable under pressure? So at a young age, it might be simple rally tolerance. So I look at rally tolerance. It's a concept that a lot of coaches want to talk about how they hit the ball and the power off the racket and the spin and all this kind of stuff. Do you have rally tolerance? Can you absorb a ball over and over again? Does the technique allow you to hit it in different positions? Can you produce the same kind of ball when your opponent is throwing you very different types of, different types of ball, different types of spins and things like that? So really simply, I think parameters are incredibly important across the whole journey. Those parameters need to be refined and they change depending on where the athlete's at. But in tennis, we work in parameters. And then those three questions, whenever I'm looking at an athlete's technique, it's always, is the technique effective, adaptable, and repeatable under pressure?
Good, Frank.
Oh, I was just thinking, let Chris answer your question, I think.
Okay.
Well, really, Frank, I think I'd like to hear from you because we haven't got a lot of time, and I would just add, I wouldn't add to what the boys have already mentioned. That they're experienced coaches, and I just endorse what they've already said.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions, but let's deal with them one at a time. We spoke about the ability of an athlete to develop a technique and so on, and I just sometimes wonder, do we go far enough back when we're trying to develop something? So, for example, and I know you've heard this story, Cliff. I was working with Jon Tyriak, asked me to work with Boris Becker to get him to move his feet faster. And so I developed all of these very clever, at least I modestly suggest, very clever practices. And he kept on falling over his feet. And then it suddenly dawned on me, I was making the biggest mistake you can ever make as a coach. Don't coach what you see, coach where it's come from. And the fact is, he had very poorly developed small muscles in his feet and the stabilizers and the synergists all the way up to his hips. He'd been able to get away with diving around the court all the time. And so if we could go back and try to mend that part, then you could build the drills in the first instance, and then, of course, the overall movement in the second. And I'll just put the question back out to my colleagues here. Has this ever happened to you? Because maybe at the very beginning, when we're starting, a young athlete comes to us, do they have the learning foundation physically, mentally, and emotionally to make the progress that you want to make with them?
If I can jump in on that one.
Yep.
I learned that as well, Frank, with coaching athletes with impairment. I had a young lad to come to me at 13 years, and he literally had his arm up against his chest. And I said, okay, show me a bench press. And he said, I can't do bench press. I can't use my arm. And I said, well, have you ever tried? And he goes, no, but people know that I can't use my arm. So we put him on the bench, and he literally hardly moved his arm. He just did not have any movement. But within 18 months, he was bench pressing. It wasn't symmetrical, but we had him bench pressing 60 kilograms. And what I learned was I don't care what the minimal amount of function somebody has, we need to develop it. And we spend a lot of time with our athletes working on proprioception, balancing on one leg and two sides on the affected leg compared to the one on the other side. It was just a matter of saying, well, what have they got and how do we use it to the most of the effect? So similar experience to yourself in that understanding the athlete is critical, but understanding what their makeup looks like. Yeah. So I appreciate what you're saying there, but it was probably a lot of the success we had. We performed the hell out of most other countries in Sydney because we took every athlete apart and put them back together with physios and strength and conditioning. And our physios and strength and conditioning teams were so unified that every athlete felt safe to try new things. And we took them out of their comfort zones and they were fabulous. I am aware, Cliff, that we've got a couple of questions in the boxes there. So
we'll come to those. We'll keep chatting for another 10 minutes or so. Any comments, Adam?
I think the last part of your question was some of the thought processes around when you make change, and and I think I'm probably aligned with Chris in you want to desensitize almost change as a process with an athlete. You want to stay really positive with everything that you're talking about, and I think the environments when we get it right with athletes, I'll use a few people that you know. For example, Ash Barty, like she was so open the environment that was created by the coaching relationship she had with a coach. She was so open to trying things in practice that other athletes would seem radical. They just seem absolutely radical. So I can remember being on the court when I had one of the young juniors and she was getting the opportunity to hit with that person. And, her coach said, Ash, I want you to try, using your slice in a different way against one of the young players and see the effectiveness of it. There's lots of players that would not try technical change a week out from a tournament and things like that. But I think it really is athlete dependent and the strength of the relationship probably gives you the opportunity, you open the opportunity for change and desensitizing the athlete to change, I think is a really, really important part when you start to make decisions around changing technique. And, we don't like to use the word regression, but at stages you have to do it. You have to regress an athlete back to the beginning and those conversations, you know, done the right way and around an athlete and a coach that have mutual trust and belief, they can be things that can be really empowering and they can be really jumping off points. But conversely, you've also got to be really careful as a coach and you got to check yourself sometimes around, where am I at with this athlete? Where are we at in our journey? As Chris mentioned, the journey, like where are we on that journey? Is this the time to do that? Because like I've seen it a lot in tennis. There are ways to build a tactical model in a moment to get an athlete through a match so that you avoid regression and you avoid those kind of negative kind of experiences. So I think those are all important considerations when you're thinking about, real technical change, especially when you get to that really elite eye level. There's got to be more to the decision than just the actual stroke they're hitting or the performance you're trying to get out. There's got to be a few more things that have to be part of that discussion.
Yeah, Martin.
Yeah, just to add to the technical changes point too, I think when you get a developed athlete and they've been doing a technique for 20 years too, you also have to take a step back and see, is it worth the change? Because they're going to be positive and negative from it. If they're doing it something that way for 20 years, there's going to be efficiencies in it. And from the outside, it might look like it's not the ideal for what that athlete needs, but do something over and over enough and your body gets used to it. So and another method is going to, on the one hand, maybe require more work for them. On the other hand, it's also going to put some more stresses on something. So if you're trying to change someone's gait pattern or something a little bit, maybe it puts a bit more pressure on the hamstring, and maybe that puts them at risk for injury in the short term as they try to change and develop something new. But also, you see this all the time in sprinters. They might have a slightly more weight on one side or less rhythm in their gait or something like this. But if that's the way they've been running for 20 years at a high level, they've probably created some efficiencies in that. And so I think we're often sometimes too quick to change instead of understanding, okay, why are they doing that? And is it worth tweaking with for whatever small gain we want to get out of it? You see that in baseball pitching quite a bit. Someone might have a more sidearm throw or something like that. They start pitching overhand, that puts a huge different stress on their shoulder, and then they get injured immediately. Where the sidearm throw, it might not be conventional, but it's how they've grown up. Their arm is used to it. Their body's used to it. They're able to get a lot of efficiency out of a non-traditional method.
So all of you have mentioned the importance of differences, right? And differences in technique, but differences in the athlete as well. But how long does it take for you to develop your craft to identify what are the key differences and the more important differences? And to what degree do you require other resources to help you to expedite that development in your craft and your ability to actually affect change?
Yeah, Cliff, I can start with that one. I think it very much depends on where you're coaching now. So, anybody who's worked in an institute would see their athletes daily, sometimes 2, sometimes even 3 times a day you'd see your athletes. So it's you get to know them really quickly, and it's very, very much a thing that you will just do as part of your coaching plan, is to say, well, where are they at and where we're going. If you are a coach of junior athletes, you might see them once or twice a week. And so that journey takes a lot longer, and you'll spend a lot of time developing a rapport. And also with the junior athletes, you don't get to see them doing the same number of repetitions that a senior athlete might do. So it's a very open-ended question from where I'm sitting in terms of, and even someone who comes at you at 20, you might have someone with 20 years of age, but it's got 10 years of track and field background, and somebody else has got 2 years of training history. So getting to know where they're at, it's just such an open-ended question. I appreciate where you're coming from, but it's only through familiarity, from my experience, and time spent with the athlete and time spent watching them perform their art.
Mm.
And I guess I was getting at a little bit to, how much of that is intuitive coaching, and intuition's it's a cognitive shortcut. It's not guessing, but it does come from experience. But it's also, how do you potentially marry that with scientific support? And what does that actually look like? And how, again, it comes back to then how do you work with sports scientists to actually help you develop your coach's eye? Any
Yeah,
thoughts?
I'll be the first one. I'll answer this one from a tennis perspective. It's a real provocative topic in tennis, right? The role of a physios and triple SM kind of staff, and how they complement the coach in the technical model and the development. In tennis, it's really the name of the game is injury prevention and the ability to repeat and back up performance day after day. So I know that we've explored and Chris mentioned visual models and things like that. We've gone away from coach and physio or coach and strength conditioning expert looking at just pure technique on a screen, and we've moved to a more model where we're on the court together, or the coach is really part of the practical environment and developing strength exercises, and so we've tried to make it a bit more organic. And I think one of the points that's really important is that this idea of a coach as a learner, as just a continual learner, that they're willing to turn over anything they can, resources, expose themselves to those kind of new ideas and different perspectives. I think is really, really important, because that's challenging. I can remember as a young person being challenged by coaches about what I was doing with an athlete. And, I'll be the first to say it can be painful when you're a young coach, like it can really mess with you. So, navigating through that and building a coach's, I guess you'd say, muscles, so that they can handle the change themselves and the feedback and those kind of things with their athletes is a really, really important step in a coach's journey. And you get through that, and then you're really good. I call it filtering. You're really good at filtering vast amounts of information and distilling them down to what you really think is important for the individual based on the power that you have, which is a relationship with the athlete. The coach knows the athlete better than anyone, that personal relationship. So your job is a funnel, but you've got to have a wide funnel. Like, you've got to be trying to look for every single thing you can do to make that athlete better. And the power of your funnel is that you distill what's important and what's going to resonate with that athlete. They get buy-in, engagement, and ultimately performance.
Good.
Martin?
Yeah, just to add 2 points on there, kind of the identifying differences and also the sports science topic. Got some points to add. First, identifying the differences. One thing I think that's helpful with young athletes is keeping a sense of play involved, and you can learn a lot from that instead of being a very rigid training environment. And Simon and his he had a comment in the chat as well. How do you balance getting a wide range of movements and a lot of variability in training with trying to build a technical model at the same time? And I think one interesting way is just to get athletes also to play with technique. We think about play in terms of games, but also play with technique. I love these videos of Djokovic, kind of mimicking other people's playing style, and doing that at a young age. I think it develops an ability to be adaptable as an athlete. It develops a broad bandwidth. It keeps training fun, and then as a coach, it helps you to see, okay, well, what might work better for that athlete? What are their differences? What do they bring to the table? And coincidentally, Matt Denny last week when he was up in Germany, he was talking about when he was young, he was training a lot by himself, but he would throw 1 week like Alekna Senior. He would throw, try to play around with that, and then he would throw another week like Lars Riedel or one of the Germans or something, and play a bit with his technique and try and mimic these heroes he had growing up. but I think that really helps him and helps a lot of athletes to think, okay, well, try the high jump with this style, try the high jump with that style, play around with it. And they're at that age, they're jumping. That's the most important thing. They're getting the volume of jumps. They're playing around, so it's a bit fun. And then you can also learn about them as a coach. On the scientific point, I think, and Rita also had a comment in here, how can AI help with developing a technical model? One thing I'll have, not all coaches have access to biomechanics and AI and all that type of stuff. So, and also we have a limited budget here, so we don't do that much. But I think one thing that we can do differently is, traditional biomechanical analysis. We take one video from a thrower, we analyze it and we compare it to whatever the ideal is in the sport. So, we might take my hammer thrower and compare some of his variables to what they measured on Yuri Sedik or something like that. And then we kind of define the gap and try to break that down and reach it. I think what we don't do enough of, and what I try and do a bit more when we're doing biomechanics, is take multiple videos of the same athlete. And then you start to see, okay, if we took 6 or 10 throws in training from this one athlete, what did they do different or better on their best throws? What is really unlocking their good throws from their bad throws, and then doing that also over the long term. But instead of trying to focus on our athlete versus the ideal or whatever we want, you can learn about them that way by seeing, okay, what do they do better on their best attempts, and how can we leverage that? And also getting their feedback alongside there too. So we take the videos, we'll get the athlete's feedback, and he might say, oh, I felt a little bit off balance here or there. Does that match with the data? Is their feeling matching up with the data? And, and have them play around on those things too. Okay, start this throw a little bit faster, start this one a little bit slower. Did they reach the parameters we wanted them to reach? So using those kind of as an experiment and getting a larger sample size of data can help you identify, okay, which direction do you want to go in the model, what's working for the athlete.
Frank, and then we'll go to Chris.
Just a quick one. Coming back to our friend Adam, Jon Tiriac, he once upon a time pulled me to one side and he said, Frankie, every technique is a compensation. It took me a little bit of a while for that to really resonate with me. I then thought about something that a guy that Cliff will know, Vin Walsh, when he was talking about strategies of learning, and he said you only take them 80% of the way. The athlete, the person who's learning, takes it the rest. And I thought, putting these two things together, I thought, well, there must be, coming back to Martin's point, there's some non-negotiables in there in terms of biomechanical principle in how they apply to this or that. And of course, you select biomechanical principles. So, for example, you don't select the same ones for jumping a straddle as you would in jumping Fosbury flop. There are some aspects of the same, but many other ones are not because of the nature of the takeoff. Anyway, it got me thinking, if we're responsible for the 80%, is the real art of coaching how we adapt to the 20% compensation? Over to you guys.
Chris, do you want to say what you wanted to say first, and then we might come to that?
Sure. I just wanted to pick up on your comment about intuition, Cliff. And one of the things I heavily relied on as I got further into my career was having trusted colleagues. And often if I felt there was something about my athlete, I wouldn't actually say, this is what I'm thinking. I would say, what are you seeing? And ask the coach to observe. And it was done through respect. And because we had great relationships, they might pick up on something, and then I could raise a question and have a very healthy discussion about the athlete from somebody I trusted. So it wasn't just me feeling as though I needed to go down a particular path, because sometimes that discussion would halt my thinking and go, you're right, we don't need to worry about that. Or other times it would open it up and allow me to explore what I was feeling and then discuss it with the athlete. So I really encourage coaches to develop a rapport with someone they trust and understand their event really well, that they can utilize in the background. It helps enormously with your own journey as a coach.
Yeah. Martin and Adam, your thoughts about Frank's question?
I don't know if I'm going to answer it, Frank, but with regards to the 20%, so the Pareto 20% that's real gold, right? And mastering change, Craig Tiley talks about it all the time in our organization, and his background is performance. He's now a CEO, but his background in performance, he says it all the time. The pain of change is greater than the pain of a loss. And so, in tennis, a lot of times as coaches, we're not brave enough, or the athlete, we haven't created that bravery to embrace change and to really go to that level of change. And so, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but it is the most important thing. I do agree with that. I agree that the coach's ability to be adaptable, and have that ability to navigate through those difficulties of change with their athlete is probably the real hidden gold behind the absolute champion coaches that are out there, right? Their ability, everyone gets to a certain level of expertise and understands how the complexities of their sport from a technical perspective and what needs to be done. But the ability to be highly adaptable in those moments of real change and real opportunity, I think, is absolutely crucial as a coach. And one thing I'll say, I totally agree with Chris's comments around trusted experts. There was a time in my own coaching, and there was a time where our philosophy at TA was to get 360 feedback from all sorts of people, and we were bringing in people to talk. It's really difficult to navigate through that feedback, but when you have a trusted expert who is considered in their commentary, they understand you as a person and as a coach, and they understand your eye and the way you see things. It's a whole different kind of mentor coaching relationship. I can't express the difference, and it's absolutely imperative that you search out those trusted experts. Without them, you are in some ways, you're flying blind as a coach. You're really not going to be able to squeeze a lemon dry from a performance perspective.
Well, thanks for that. The point I was trying to make about the 20% is that this is where the athlete, and you've all said it, the athlete has their own interpretation of things, whether it's from Mondo Duplantis to the young man who at the moment is trying to do a 270-degree turn in discus. So the athlete decides to go a particular way, and we've got to make judgment calls in there as to how we can adapt to what's happening in front of us, because this is, I think, I can't remember who it was that said it, this is adapting this is adapting to the athlete rather than having the athlete adapt to the technique. And I just was interested in, because do bear in mind that not everybody listening in here has got access to science and to biomechanical analysis and so on, and they're having to make judgment calls. So I think it was Rita mentioned in the chat about once you can control the arms, the athlete's got stability and so on. But what if the athlete doesn't want to do a single arm shift, as we all kind of work on now, and instead wants to do a partial double arm shift? Do we then insist, no, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be doing this? Or do we adapt to what the athlete's got and get the maximum out of that? I think that's...
Actually, the word adaptable, I think, is relevant to everybody in the ecosystem, particularly coaches and athletes. So we need people to be responsive and to be adaptable. And I think you're in trouble when you've got a very rigid view of the technical model and a very rigid view of what an athlete should look like in relation to that technical model. I just thought it's a really good conversation, but we've got a couple of comments in the chat room. Rita said that junior athletes usually take time to develop as top senior athletes. And they all, to that point, they also come from different pathways sometimes. Is there any comment on the new wave of young athletes and elite performance? Any thoughts there?
For us in Australia, it's a societal thing, Cliff. Like, we've got a community of entitled young people, and I say that with all respect. Boy, it's a tough world out there now. With, I can remember the old days where athletes would buy their own shoes and they'd bloody pay their membership to the gym. Now everybody's asking, well, who's going to pay for it? So I think from a coaching perspective, you quickly find out who the heck wants to be successful and is prepared to do the hard work. There is certainly a shift, and the way we speak as coaches, the way we treat our athletes, it's like I call it the wellness plague in Australia at the moment. We have some sports where athletes aren't performing well because everybody's running around saying, "Are you okay?" Our job as coaches is to take them out of their comfort zone and extend their capabilities and competencies, and that includes psychologically as well. Not everybody wants to be a world champion. We're all looking for the one that does, and that's different to normal society. So yeah, I hear what Red is saying. This new wave is a bit different to work with, and we have to be aware of that as coaches. But underneath it all, we're looking for that animal that wants to be a success.
Yeah, but we need to be adaptable too. And my question too, when I ask people in an audience, put up your hand if you think young people today have a great sense of entitlement. Well, everybody throws their hand up. But then I think the next important question is, well, who's produced that? Who's caused that? Who's created that? And it's actually our generation. So for whatever reasons, we've actually allowed that to happen. So I think that we need to look in the mirror as well. And how do we actually then, reshape young people in more productive ways?
I think, Cliff, just to follow up on that, we can call them an entitlement generation, but we could also turn that into kind of a positive. We've developed a curious, questioning generation.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I don't think there's nothing wrong with it. It should be questioning, but what we have to teach them is the right kind of questions to be asking.
Yeah. I know, and I think more and more young people want autonomy. They want some freedom to have some say in some things. And I think those two things can play alongside of each other too. I don't think it's either or. But I think that this comes back to co-construction and co-design. Everyone should be seen as partners in the process. It's not just a person who dictates the terms of reference. It's actually a partnership between all actors in the ecosystem. And we need to give people voice and be receptive to people's different voices, even if we don't agree. But that makes us uncomfortable. We're not comfortable when somebody doesn't agree with us. And for me, that's one of the issues in technical development is when you change something, it's not always comfortable to the athlete.
No.
Right? And sometimes, you got to play with being uncomfortable for a period of time until you get the technical change that you want. But what they are feeling may be what you want them to feel, but it's different. Right? And that's part of the learning process too. I'll go to Peter Hannon's got a comment here. I think safety needs to be primary concern and therefore high on the list of priorities for young athletes. For example, hurdles. If the arms are controlled first, then they start to feel safer rather than aeroplane wings. Any thoughts?
Cliff, I would just say that comes back to knowing your event. Like the event's designed to be safe. There's certain ways of coaching where, if an athlete's standing in the wrong area with discus, javelin or shot put, they're deadly implements. So there needs to be that safety development. Hurdles, I think unfortunately a lot of schools don't do hurdles, and we used to crash and burn through the hurdles, but it was fun. And I think there is an element of technique that gets the athlete over more efficiently. So I do appreciate that not only is a technical element, but it is a safety element as well. But you lower the hurdle, and I'm yet to meet an athlete that couldn't learn to hurdle, and just depending on what level, but with repetition, they become successful.
Yeah.
And
Any other thoughts?
in tennis, when we think about safety, there's the obvious impediments, balls on the court, those kind of things. But what we really try to focus on is, training loads based on age, competitive loads, like how much an athlete that we have certain athletes that are, just like in any sport, they're quite laconic, and the amount of output they put into a match is different from others. And we have some athletes that win matches easily and they're at risk of breaking them, because they just put so much tension into their match and so much anxiety. So a lot of when we talk about safety, it's really making sure in tennis at the appropriate age, the players are competing at the appropriate amount of matches. Their training loads are being monitored in a very, I guess the younger the ages are, we don't make a big song and dance about it. We're not exposing kids to training, their training information or things like that. We're not trying to, because that breeds anxiety in itself and can affect, the mind affects the body. But we are monitoring those kind of things from a safety perspective because yeah, in tennis, the big safety issues are, injury related to training loads and competitive loads, marrying those two things up based on the age and the athlete.
I've got a question here that came from Debbie Strange on behalf of a coach of young kids in New Zealand. And the main question was, how can I make training interesting, fun, not boring, and beneficial for a range of kids at varying levels of performance? And it connected, I think, with your comment, Martin. How do you play with technique that actually can be an enjoyable aspect of what is coaching? Interested in people's thoughts. Maybe you go first, Martin.
Yeah, I mentioned some earlier, but also throwing different types in the throwing events, throwing different types of implements. So, if you're a javelin thrower, also throw a stick, throw, other things. In discus, you can vary up the implement, make it a bit more playful. And one of the things we do in the hammer throw is also, doing target practice. Like hammer throw is all about the distance. So we focus all about the distance and the speed of release and these types of things. Having that feeling to know, okay, well, this throw needs to go to the right more, this throw needs to go to the left. That's also a skill. If you can master that, you can master micro adjustments in competition and things like that. And it becomes more of a game that anyone can win. So whether it's, a far throw or a short throw, if we put a cone in the middle of the sector at 30 meters, 40 meters, 50 meters, 60 meters and say, okay, let's see who can get the closest there, or let's take 10 throws and see who gets the most on the target. You can make a bit of a game out of things, and it then becomes about accuracy, not just distance. So even the beginners who aren't throwing as far can have a chance to play. But like these are skills that we think about the performance result, but also developing that fine-tuned feeling of being able to adjust where it goes in the sector, to being able to increase the intensity, lower the intensity, and still keep your technical model. Those are skills. A lot of people can execute a technical model at 90%, but then it falls apart at 100%. So they're not able to dial up and dial down. So, little things like that, I think, can help not just make training more fun, but they also develop the robustness of the technique over the long term.
Adam or Chris?
Yeah, I'd agree with what
I
Martin.
think fun
you
just
go,
comes
Chris.
from. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
You go, Chris.
No, I was just to say, for me, fun, it's the personality of the coach. Let the athletes see who you are, be comfortable with who you are, and have fun. Nothing wrong, with just being lighthearted at training. The more they enjoy the training, whilst they're working hard, if they can smile or laugh about it, then they're going to keep coming back. So it's critically important. And the socialization, particularly for junior athletes, to feel part of a bigger group. It's, athletics can be a tough, lonely place. But if you can create, and you talk about your environment, Cliff, or the ecosystem, kids like being together. They like to have fun. So somebody asked a question about the social media stuff, but I would put that aside. There's no phones at training. The coach doesn't turn up with the phone unless it's being used for a video analysis. But the kids will have fun on themselves if you let them. So let them play, and it's also a good way, particularly if you're a multi-event type athlete, to learn to switch on and switch off. So you can't be focused for the whole training session, but when I want you to focus, learn to turn on, and then when you take some downtime to switch that off. So that's part of the training as well, is just that enjoyment. But it also, a big component of me says that it's about coaches' attitude to training themselves.
Yeah, sure.
Just to echo on that too, can I add one thing real quick? When I was an athlete too, I was training with Anatoly Bondarchuk, and if anyone knows about his training, it's the most monotonous style of training you can have. And on the outside, it looks like it's completely boring. But I had the most fun in that training environment because we had an awesome training group. So you're going to train every day with your friends, and we're getting better. Like getting better is fun. Throwing far is fun. So it comes down, as Chris was saying, if you have a good training environment, and you have that culture, and you're getting better, then it doesn't have to be sexy training. It doesn't have to be something fancy, but those are like I think the cornerstones to build upon.
Yep. I couldn't agree more with all those statements. The thing that we talk about, and it was backed by the comments that when I did research, was the concept of hard but fun. Like children love to know that they're doing something that other people can't do. And all athletes like that. I won't even say children, but every athlete loves to know that they're doing something that only a few people can do. So balancing that complexity and that challenge but also making it fun is just incredibly important. And don't neglect the little things, like just grabbing that player after a training session and reinforcing what a great job they did over maybe 2 or 3 things. They might have done 6 things bad, but just go and grab them and tell them that they did those 2 things, because athletes are the biggest critics. We think we're the biggest critics of our athletes' performance, but there's no bigger critic than the athlete themselves, right? They will think of 15 things they didn't do well, and they won't be able to see the 3 things that they did at a world-class level. So this concept of making the practices hard and challenging, it absolutely has to be a fundamental part of what you're doing. Otherwise, you're not doing your job. You know, that's participation. That's growing participation, which is admirable, and we've all got a responsibility to do that in the sport. But when we talk about high performance, it must be challenging environments. They must be complex. They must have to really push them, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be fun. And it doesn't mean you can't use simple coaching, you know, take that player aside and just tell them how well they're doing across something that they weren't as good at last week. It's actually really, really powerful, those little things.
Frank?
Yeah, just picking up on this. I think some of you will know the guy Boris Verkovsky, who's the chief coach for the Cirque du Soleil, and he explained to me at one point why he thought Western thinking when it came to drills and technique was not the same as Eastern thinking. If you forget all the drugs and bits and pieces, he said that in Eastern Europe, they were less obsessed with different points of technique than they were about the quality of drills when they're being done. And he said, in the West, we tend to be obsessive about the technique, and we are not so careful about our drills. And if you want an example of that, I'd like you to take, the next time you're at a major competition, have a wander around the warm-up area and ask yourself if these athletes are actually thinking about what they're doing. The point I'm trying to make here is fun they must be, but done properly they must be. And I think I'm just suggesting to all coaches, please don't take drills for granted. Be absolutely on top of them and make sure they're done the way they should be done. Otherwise, the purpose is not served. Your thoughts, Doug?
Makes me think, before we just wrap up, if you're overemphasizing technical nuances, a consequence of that may well be a loss of fluency of movement. And we know that when you have a fluidity of movement, the muscles will produce bigger forces. So it's trying. I don't like the word balance, but again, an overemphasis of one thing at the expense of others can also have psychological concerns for the athlete who starts to worry about what they can't do. Because in my view, under pressure, all you have are your strengths. So focus on what their strengths are going into all competitions, because if you focus on what they can't do, trust me, it'll happen. It'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, okay, over to you, Frank, and then we'll wrap up. But I just want to say thank you to Chris, Martin, and Adam. Fantastic insights, and this has generated a wonderful conversation. And I think we could go on for a couple of hours. And there's some really good questions from the audience as well. So thank you, Frank.
Thanks, Chris. And just before I do my summary here, coming back to somebody that you mentioned, Martin, Bondarchuk, a long time ago as a young coach, I was running a conference in Edinburgh, and he'd come across to talk about hammer, and we went down to do a demonstration, and everybody clustered around the net, and he was stood about 20 meters away. And I said to the Ludmilla, his interpreter, please ask him to come close. I'll get rid of these people, make them move to the other side. And his response through hers was, if you get too close, you can't see everything. You must be able to sense the rhythm first. It comes back to a point I think you mentioned yourself, Martin. Rhythm is everything. His point was, as a coach, not having any visual camera stuff and so on, videos. His point was at that stage of coach development, if you like, was that you have to work. You have to stand back to get the sense of rhythm, because if the rhythm is fractured in any way, then you have to get closer and start working on it. And then coming back to your point, Chris, start from the feet up. Start from the feet up. So that's just a thought. Okay, very quickly, I love the know the differences of the athlete, know the differences of technique, and align the two things. Don't intuitively copy the superstars. I mentioned the 80% to 20%, and I'm building that on something that Chris said about it's always about the different. Oh, no, it wasn't Chris. I think it was Martin said. It's always about the difference. It's always about the difference, and I think that difference is in the 20%. Make sure that you understand what is very negotiable, what is somewhat negotiable, and what is definitely non-negotiable. The time on the ground was an interesting one for two reasons for me. One was a comment that used to be made by my former coach Jeff Gowan, when he said, in hurdling, time in the air is time wasted. And the other bit about contact with the ground is this is where your power comes from. And if you're flying through the air when you're trying to throw a shot or a discus, where is the stability to that? Surely there must be some point of contact at some point, even if it's your toes. And also related to this, back in the days of straddle, it was all about strength. The biomechanical principles, transfer of momentum, and so on, was all about strength and time on the ground. But Fosbury flop is absolutely the opposite. It's a speed thing, and it's a bouncing thing off the ground, and that was not happening previously. So we as coaches have got to be very careful on which biomechanical principles we are addressing when we're trying to develop. I like the idea of looking at the anthropometric difference, the aptitude or ability difference, and the type and strategy. I like the other point was technical model must serve the athlete, not the other way around. Thanks for that, Adam. Create small successes and build success elements, and build these into your coaching. And make sure, again, from your comments, Chris, keep it simple. Don't give them three things to think about at the same time. One thing at a time, and keep it simple. And always remember that it always comes down to being brilliant at basics. Right? It's being brilliant at your basics, and that, if you like, comes back to the simple. Oh, just a little aside on that. Working with a rugby team, an international rugby team, it became very clear that some of the players who were coming to the national team were there purely and simply because they were more talented than other people. But oddly enough, their basics were very weak. Whereas other players that had to concentrate on that, they just ignored them. Well, you cannot ignore them when you get into the international arena. So for all of us in this call, make sure we attend to basics. Keep your basics brilliant. As we spoke about the foundation to learn. When we're trying to develop our athletes, have we taken time to go back and understood, are they ready physically, mentally, and I have to say, and a lot of people say this is very twee, are they ready emotionally? And I think we have a responsibility to assess all three things as we go through. And related to that, as I said earlier, don't coach what you see, coach where it's come from. And finally, just a little point from myself, from what we've discussed here today, know your purpose, know your athletes, know yourself, and know your stuff. And we'll get it right. Cliff, magnificent job, mate. Thank you very much indeed. And to Chris, Adam, and Martin. And also behind the scenes here, Senna and Sheila did a fantastic job, kids. And behind even further, We've got Jimson Lee, who did a brilliant job in our technology here. Thanks very much indeed, folks. I actually think, Cliff, we should come back to this one again.
I think so too. Okay. Good night, everyone.